Going from rags to riches is America's favorite story. It's capitalism's favorite story as it portrays the arduous journey of individuals taking keen initiative, combined with hard work and determination to rise from the ashes of poverty to the grandeur of wealth. Such stories can only be found in an economic system that rewards the sweat of the brow by opening the gates to higher standards of living. Horatio Alger, not many realize, was a real person who in the mid to late 19th century wrote countless moral tales directed at young boys, aiming to inspire them to leave their humble backgrounds for the security of middle-class lives. He emphasized hard work, determination, courage, and honesty. But it was the old, up from the bootstraps kind of admonition. This is what you needed to do, and you had an obligation to pull yourself up by those bootstraps. Horatio Alger's young adult books did not always sell that well. In fact, once when he suffered a long period of time between publications, not knowing quite what to do with himself, he decided to enroll in Harvard Divinity School. I mean, that's a great way to beat ennui. I got nothing to do, I'll go to the Harvard Divinity School. And he became a Unitarian minister and settled in a parish in Brewster on Cape Cod. His ministry lasted only 2 years as he was charged with sexual misconduct, or as it was phrased back then, the crime of unnatural familiarity with boys. Now, I'm not suggesting a correlation between capitalism and pedophilia. Oh, no, I'm not. I'm not really. Just, for your edification, just adding a bit more of the bizarre Unitarian history that has come along. Horatio Alger, by the way, admitted his guilt, dissolved his association with the Unitarian Church of Brewster, and sent Boston a letter of remorse in which he assured all that he had no intention of ever resuming the ministry again. No further action was taken. However, a considerable number of rags to riches stories continued to be published for the rest of his life. The rags to riches stories continues to be personified by the major power brokers of our time. We are all probably well aware by now that House Speaker John Boehner once worked as a bartender and a custodian. Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin flipped burgers at McDonald's. Iowa Senator Joni Ernst put bread bags over her shoes while growing up poor. It seems as though one can't run for office these days unless one has risen from poverty. If you'll remember from the 2012 presidential election, even Mitt and Ann Romney tried to convince us how poor they were back in the day. Candidates tried to personify the Horatio Alger myth, reinforcing the noble concept that America is a land of equal opportunity where everyone, every single person willing to work will be rewarded with an opulent lifestyle. Scott Walker told a crowd in Iowa this year, America is one of the few places left in the world where it doesn't matter what class you were born into. It doesn't matter what your parents do for a living. Except, of course, we know it matters. As I listen to the many stories of wealthy people discussing their journeys to success, I'm left wondering about that human emotion known as empathy. Don't they realize that with a few bad breaks, their stories could have ended otherwise? Instead of extending a certain responsiveness to those who have been unable to lift themselves out of poverty, there's an air of moral superiority that insinuates a certain character flaw among the poor. They're regarded as either unwilling to remove themselves from poverty, or they're just deadbeats. Recalling one's rise from poverty, certainly overstated in most cases, creates nostalgia about the bad old days, a kind of poverty chic. The rise from one class to another, as the story goes, remains tied to individual will and determination. Instead of showing a kernel of compassion for the lower economic class to which Scott Walker claims he once belonged, he opposes raising the minimum wage from the poverty level of $7.25 an hour. He believes that raising the minimum wage kills jobs. He refuses to take into account that states that have raised their minimum wage are creating jobs at a faster pace than those holding on to those lower pay scales. Even Walmart, and this will tell you something. Walmart, which pioneered the whole business of making billions of dollars in profits on the backs of the poor, Walmart is paying its workers in Wisconsin more than what Scott Walker believes is necessary for them to live on. Senator Joni Ernst is working with her fellow erstwhile poor colleagues in Congress to take away health care for millions of Americans. Go figure. I guess the Horatio Alger story is about climbing the ladder and never having to look back. My question is, does not the message of getting rich without worrying about the cost to others, doesn't that pose a moral quandary? Does not morality imply working towards the common good? Now, our experience during these many years now of enormous income inequality gives me pause. The very rich, aside from getting richer, are enjoying expansive entitlements that promote the idea that personal wealth best remain untethered to responsibilities to those who suffer in poverty. Enormous wealth these days has acquired a moral legitimacy, whereby great affluence has emerged as one's moral right, even at the cost of other people. Now, this moral viewpoint, which presently vexes our nation, is more of an affirmation of greed than capitalism itself. Although it can be argued that unregulated capitalism lights the spark of greed within the human heart, our current practice of capitalism is not exactly what Adam Smith had in mind. Originally, capitalism was to create a rising standard of living benefiting the general welfare of everyone. The value of capitalism, as it once was practiced, meant that the rising tide would lift all boats. Well, these days, only the yachts seem to be rising. The tides have been worked over, manipulated, where fundamental freedoms, fundamental opportunities are no longer fairly distributed. The social promise of capitalism as beneficial to everyone has vanished. Capitalism, even as late as post-World War II, upheld a moral responsibility to a living wage, well-maintained roads, good schools, and if this required capping or heavily taxing banker or CEO bonuses, the wealthy had no recourse. All is fair if needed for capitalism to actually do what it's supposed to do. But now capitalism seems to be playing by a whole new set of rules. The moral justification for self-interest rests, ironically, on Christian values. In order to resemble the image of our Maker, human beings must learn to act responsibly in life so as not to be a burden to others. That's one way of expressing it. Or we show gratitude for the freedom and liberty we are granted by working hard and making the most of our good choices. Regarding the common good, whatever happened to that idea? Regarding the common good, well, many Christians insist that it is morally sufficient to rely on charity, in lieu of changing an economic system that keeps the poor trapped in poverty for generations upon generations. But isn't charity just a little too easy and convenient? I like how the New York Times columnist Anand Giridharadas frames it. The rich are to be praised for the good they do with their philanthropy, but they are never challenged for the harm they do in their businesses. He suggested that in these days of growing income inequality, this approach is no longer good enough. Sometimes I wonder, he said, whether these various forms of giving back have become to our era what the papal indulgences were to the Middle Ages, a relatively inexpensive way of getting oneself seemingly on the right side of justice without having to alter the fundamentals of one's life. Rather than appeal to the conscience of those whose moral superiority gives me the feeling they actually despise the poor, I would ask instead, on a very, very basic theological level, is economic growth God's priority? Or put another way, isn't God more interested in right relations among human beings? When Jesus laid down the overarching moral principle to love God and love your neighbor as yourself, it's meant for us to examine our relationships with others. Love, he talks about love is a quality of relationships. It does not pertain to financial wealth. One of the things I hope we can get into a little bit this morning, because it's so deliciously controversial, is one of the most incredible teachings, I think, that you'll find in the Bible, and that is the parable of the talents. Was this really a plug for capitalism, or was it not? So I want to go through, and this I'm not going to translate freely. I'm going to read you the actual parable, and it is astounding. If you don't already know it, it might help to get reacquainted with this parable. Keep in mind, Is it pro-capitalism or not? Jesus says, it is like a man on his way abroad who summoned his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to a third 1, each in proportion to his ability. Then he set out. The man who received the 5 talents promptly went and traded with them and made 5 more. The man who received 2 made 2 more in the same way. But the man who had received 1 went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. Sort of like a savings bank account nowadays. Now, a long time after, the master of these servants came back and went through his account with them. The man who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more. Sir, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. Here are 5 more that I have made. And his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have shown you can be faithful in small things. I will trust you with greater. Come and join in your master's happiness. And next, the man with 2 talents came forward. Sir, he said, you entrusted me with 2 talents. Here are 2 more than I have made. And his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have shown that you can be faithful in small things. I will trust you with greater. Come and join in your master's happiness. Conservative Christians view the master as God who has a penchant for smart investments that make a handsome profit. Last came forward the man who had 1 talent. Uh-oh. Sir, he said, I have heard you were a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered. So I was afraid, and I went off and hid your talent in the ground. Here it is. It was yours. You have it back. But his master answered him, you wicked and lazy servant. So you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered. Well then, you should have deposited my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have recovered my capital with interest. So now, take the talent from him and give it to the man who has the 5 talents. Now, let me go on. This is directly from the Bible. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have more than enough. To everyone who has will be given more, and he will have more than enough. I think this is where Ayn Rand kind of got her material. And then it just gives me chills. From the man who has not, even what he has will be taken away. As for this good-for-nothing servant, throw him out into the dark where there will be weeping and grinding of teeth. So this parable is exhibit A for capitalism as moral. It says so right there in the Bible, doesn't it? It supports the economic philosophy that capital markets ensure that money is allocated to those in society who will use it most efficiently and increase society's wealth the fastest. Capital providers are to be rewarded just for allowing their capital to be used. A religion defends capitalism, or so it can be interpreted, because the parable of the talents demonstrates we must invest and even take risks for the sake of the kingdom. Pope Francis, on the other hand, and I think many like him, would argue that the parable claims that the absentee landlord reaps where he did not sow, and so the third servant was a whistleblower who unmasked the master for who he really was, exploiting the profits of exploitation in wasteful excess. The third servant is punished for speaking the truth, not for failing to make a profit. The real message of the parable, then, is for us to act in solidarity with others when confronting economic injustice. We need to act in solidarity with others when confronting economic injustice. And so this liberal interpretation brings us to labor and unions and union organizers like Joe Hill, minimum wages, economic justice, collective bargaining, all representing obstacles in our capitalistic system to realizing greater profits for corporations and shareholders. Capitalism, as purely self-serving, undermines any and all efforts to serve the common good. And isn't our attention to the common good where moral issues are defined and resolved? Aren't matters concerning Medicaid, health care, unemployment insurance, minimum wage interwoven into a divine concern for right relations, how we ought to be with our neighbor, the right relations? And the language that keeps reoccurring these days is economic redistribution. Redistribution of money. What does that do to the Horatio Alger story? What does that do to capitalism's appeal to the aspiring heart to make tons of money? The rags to riches story feels indelibly imprinted in our souls. You know, it is the American way. And I think it may take more time than Bernie Sanders thinks for America to make a profound economic shift. But who knows? Income inequality may have, in fact, reached its end point in how much wealth disparity the public will tolerate. I think that's where we are right now. How much income disparity in wealth will the public tolerate? And I'm beginning to sense, just a little bit for the most part, that capitalism is losing its moral legitimacy. The truth of the matter is that moving from one class to another in this country has gotten much more difficult. The wealthy still provide for the children the right tutors, the right schools, the right connections, the right jobs. They are not vulnerable to one large medical bill or college tuition costs that can wipe them out completely. Morality. It's all about how we ought to live. What are our priorities? What is our responsibility to our neighbor? Are we, as a nation, ready to accept that morality is rooted in right relations? The pendulum has begun to move, I think, in this direction. I think it's only a matter of time. For the sake of rediscovering, putting back together, rebuilding our moral legitimacy as a nation, let us hope that that pendulum has reached its peak and is beginning to move again for the common good. Let us hope. Can we conclude our service turning our hymn books, please, to number 168? As we extinguish the chalice, may beauty be our companion and courage our resolve. May integrity be our strength and kindness our guide. Amen.